June 22, 1941, dawn breaks over the western frontier of the Soviet Union, and within hours the sky itself seems to rupture. The invasion of Operation Barbarossa does not begin with speeches or ceremony, it begins with fire. German bombers roar overhead in tight, disciplined formations. Airfields explode before Soviet pilots can even reach their aircraft. Rows of fighters burn wingtip to wingtip. Radios crackle with confusion, orders collide with counterorders. And in the span of a single morning, the Red Army Air Force loses more aircraft than most nations possess in total. It is not merely defeat, it is shock, the kind that fractures institutions from the inside. And in that moment, as black smoke coils into the summer sky, a terrifying question takes shape. If the Luftwaffe can do this on the first day, what will remain by the second? The Soviet Air Force in 1941 is vast on paper, but brittle in reality. Years of purges have stripped it of experienced leadership. Doctrine is rigid, emphasizing tight formations and centralized control, effective in theory, disastrous in chaos. Many aircraft are obsolete, radios are unreliable. Pilots are brave but undertrained. Against them stands the Luftwaffe at the height of its operational mastery, flexible, combat-hardened, and devastatingly precise. Entire regiments are caught on the ground. Others rise into the air only to be cut apart by Messerschmitt Bf-109s flown by veterans of Poland and France. Soviet bombers lumber forward without adequate fighter escort, coordination collapses. Losses mount so quickly that accurate accounting becomes impossible. Within weeks, thousands of Soviet aircraft are destroyed. The sky over Belarus and Ukraine becomes a graveyard of twisted aluminum. Far from the immediate carnage, a young instructor watches events unfold with mounting dread. Ivan Kozhedub, born in 1920 in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, is a product of the Soviet flying club system, disciplined, methodical, talented. When the invasion begins, he does not rush into battle. He remains behind, training cadets even as the front consumes entire air armies. For a young man who longs to fight, the waiting is its own torment. He reads casualty reports. He studies combat tactics gleaned from survivors. He knows that when his moment comes, it will not be glorious, it will be unforgiving. And somewhere in the burning West, the Luftwaffe continues to tighten its grip, but the Red Air Force is not dead yet. It is absorbing punishment, learning painful lessons that will not reveal their value until much later. By late 1942, when Kozhedub finally reaches the front, the war in the air has begun to shift, subtly, almost imperceptibly. New aircraft like the Slovakian Lu-5 are entering service, more capable at low altitudes where much of the Eastern Front combat unfolds. Survivors of the early disasters have hardened into veterans. Tactical rigidity is loosening under battlefield necessity. Communication improves, coordination tightens. The transformation is incomplete, fragile but real. And yet, the Luftwaffe remains formidable. The skies are still lethal. The question now is not whether Soviet pilots will fight. It is whether they can endure long enough to master the fight. In March 1943, flying a Lu-5 over the Voronezh front, Kozhedub's test arrives without warning. Separated from his wingmen, he finds himself attacked by 6 German Bf-110 heavy fighters. Cannon fire shreds his fuselage, tracers slice past the cockpit glass. As he dives to escape, Soviet anti-aircraft batteries mistake him for the enemy and open fire. Metal tears through metal, his aircraft shudders violently. Instruments fail, smoke fills the cockpit. For a split second, death feels inevitable, suspended between German guns above and Soviet shells below. Somehow, through instinct and discipline, he wrestles the crippled fighter back toward friendly lines and lands. The ground crew stares at the wreckage in disbelief. It should have been the end of his career. Instead, it ignites something inside him. And if he can survive that, what else might be possible? Then comes August 1943, Kursk. The largest tank battle in history rages below, but above it another struggle unfolds. The German offensive falters, Soviet forces counterattack. In 10 days of relentless combat, Kozhedub claims 11 solo victories, 11 not through reckless heroics, but through precision, patience, and controlled aggression. The hunted becomes the hunter. Soviet formations are no longer simply reacting, they are dictating engagements. The Red Air Force is not yet supreme, but it is no longer prey. Something fundamental has changed in the balance of the sky. The transformation is still incomplete. The losses of 1941 echo in every squadron. The Luftwaffe remains dangerous, adaptive, ruthless. But the Red Air Force has crossed an invisible threshold, from collapse to resistance, from resistance to competence. And competence in war is the first step toward dominance. Yet the path forward will demand more than improved aircraft and refined doctrine. It will demand acts so extreme, so desperate, that they blur the line between courage and annihilation, and in the months ahead, some pilots will choose a solution that defies reason itself. If you're drawn to stories where history unfolds not in conference rooms, but in cockpits, where transformation is measured in survival, consider subscribing and liking this video. It helps more people discover these untold chapters of the Eastern Front, stories forged in fire and written across the sky. Before mastery came desperation, and in 1941, desperation was everywhere. Soviet pilots took off knowing their aircraft were slower, their radios unreliable, their tactics outdated. Many had only months of flight training, some had barely fired their weapons in live conditions. Yet when German formations appeared overhead, there was no option but to climb into the sky and meet them. The losses were staggering, squadrons vanished in days. Entire air regiments were reduced to fragments. And as aircraft burned across fields from Minsk to Smolensk, a brutal truth emerged. Conventional tactics were failing, and if nothing changed, the Red Air Force would be erased from the war entirely. In this crucible of collapse, one pilot embraced a solution so extreme it bordered on madness. Boris Kovzan was not reckless by nature. He was methodical, disciplined, trained within the same Soviet system that had produced thousands of young aviators before the war. But by October 1941, flying the high-altitude MiG-3 against experienced German crews, he confronted a grim arithmetic. Ammunition ran out, guns jammed, engines faltered, and the enemy kept coming. In that moment, when distance closed and options vanished, Kovzan made a choice few could even contemplate. He drove his aircraft directly into the tail of a German bomber. The maneuver had a name: Turan, aerial ramming. Official doctrine described it as a last resort. Propaganda would later frame it as heroic self-sacrifice. But in the sky, stripped of ideology, it was a split-second calculation between certain defeat and catastrophic collision. Kovzan survived his first ramming, the German aircraft did not. Most pilots would never attempt it again. Kovzan did again and again and again. Between October 1941 and August 1942, he rammed for enemy aircraft out of the sky while flying a succession of fighters, MiG-3 South, Yak variants, Leviathans. Each collision demanded precision, striking the enemy's tail or wing while preserving just enough structural integrity to bail out or limp home. Each time, survival was improbable. Each time, he chose impact over surrender. Word spread through the regiments. Some whispered admiration, others disbelief. A few wondered how long fate would tolerate such defiance. By his fourth ramming in August 1942, fate seemed ready to answer. Engaging the Junkers Route 80A at altitude, Kovzan's guns reportedly failed. Wounded during the attack, accounts say a bullet struck his face, possibly his eye. He closed the distance anyway. The collision shattered both aircraft. The sky exploded into debris. Kovzan was thrown free, falling thousands of feet before crashing into a marshland below. German crews reported him dead. Soviet units assumed the same. But against all logic, he survived. Rescuers found him grievously injured, disfigured, barely conscious, yet alive. The story grew in the telling. Some details blurred between battlefield report and legend. But one fact remains undeniable: Boris Kovzan returned to duty. He would finish the war credited with 28 victories. And in the darkest phase of the Eastern Front Air War, his actions became emblematic of something deeper than propaganda. They represented a force refusing extinction even at the cost of its own machines. But Terran was never a sustainable strategy. It destroyed aircraft the Soviet Union could scarcely afford to lose. It risked pilots already in short supply. It was not mastery. It was survival at the edge of annihilation, and survival alone cannot win a prolonged war. As 1940 turned toward 1943, something subtle began to shift. Soviet industry, relocated beyond the Urals, was producing improved fighters in increasing numbers. Training programs adapted to the brutal lessons of 1941. Veterans who had survived the inferno began mentoring new arrivals. Formations loosened, initiative was cautiously encouraged. The Red Air Force was still blooded, but it was no longer flailing blindly. And yet, one vast battle still loomed that would test whether these painful adaptations were enough. Over the city of Stalingrad, smoke from burning factories climbed into the same sky where fighters circled and dived. The Luftwaffe sought to dominate the Volga corridor. The Soviets fought not just for air superiority, but for national survival. It was here that a new kind of legend would rise, not born of desperation, but of precision. Not forged through collision, but through calculated aggression. And among those legends would be a young woman whose presence in a fighter cockpit challenged assumptions on both sides of the front, a pilot whose story would outlive the regime that first used her image for inspiration. Because by 1943, the Red Air Force was no longer asking how to die gloriously, it was learning how to win. By the autumn of 1942, the sky over Stalingrad had become a furnace. Smoke from burning oil depots and shattered factories drifted upward in thick, choking columns. Below, soldiers fought for stairwells and rubble piles. Above, fighters circled in tight spirals, engines screaming, tracers stitching the air. The Luftwaffe sought to crush resistance along the Volga. The Red Air Force fought not merely to contest the sky, but to deny Germany total dominance. And in this maelstrom, where survival depended on seconds and instinct, a young pilot with a painted white lily on her aircraft canopy would step into history, though no one yet understood how brief her time would be. Lydia Litvyak had wanted to fly since childhood. When Germany invaded in 1941, she joined the newly formed all-female aviation regiments, entering the 586th Fighter Regiment. She reportedly exaggerated her flight hours to gain acceptance, not out of vanity, but urgency. The war was not waiting for perfection, it was demanding participation. In 1942, she was transferred to a frontline unit over Stalingrad, flying the Yak-1 fighter. The aircraft was agile, well-suited for the low-altitude dogfights that defined the Eastern Front. Her Yak bore the number 32. On its fuselage, she painted a white lily, a small flourish in a theater of smoke and steel. In September 1942, during one of her first major engagements, she claimed 2 victories in a single day, a Junkers Ru-88 bomber and a Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighter. It was not a symbolic gesture, it was combat performance under lethal pressure. German pilots who encountered her did not see propaganda, they saw skill. Yet skill alone did not shield her from suspicion. Soviet command culture remained rigid, wary of individualism. Litvyak was known to be independent, outspoken, sometimes dismissive of authority. She refused reassignment to rear areas. She resisted switching to newer aircraft models, preferring the Yak-1 she knew intimately. Admirers saw confidence, critics saw defiance. And as her reputation grew, so did the scrutiny around her, because in Stalin's Soviet Union, even heroes were not beyond doubt. By 1943, the tide of the war had begun to turn. Stalingrad had broken the myth of German invincibility. Soviet formations were better coordinated, pilots were gaining experience. The Red Air Force was no longer improvising survival, it was asserting control. Litvyak continued to fight aggressively, racking up confirmed victories. Sources differ on the exact tally, but all agree on the milestone. She became the first confirmed female flying ace in history. Her image circulated in newspapers, a young woman in flight gear, composed, confident. For propaganda officials, she was invaluable. For her comrades, she was simply another pilot who could be relied upon in combat. Then on August 1st, 1943, over the Donbas region, she took off once more. Engaging German fighters beneath scattered cloud cover, she maneuvered into combat. Witnesses reported her pursuing to be F-109s into the clouds. Then nothing, no distress call. No parachute sighted, the sky closed behind her. When her squadron regrouped, her aircraft was gone. For decades, Lydia Litvyak was listed as missing in action. Rumors spread, capture, survival, secret imprisonment. No wreckage was found, no definitive report surfaced. Her name hovered between legend and uncertainty. And in a war already saturated with loss, her disappearance felt symbolic, as though the sky itself had claimed one of its own. It was not until 1989 that remains were discovered and identified. In 1990, she was posthumously awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. Recognition came late, decades after the smoke had cleared. But by then, her story had already transcended ideology. Her career reflected a broader transformation. By 1943, Soviet pilots were no longer ramming out of desperation. They were maneuvering with intent. They were studying enemy tactics. They were competing and often winning against experienced Luftwaffe aces. The Red Air Force had grown sharper, more flexible, more confident. And yet, even as performance improved, contradictions simmered beneath the surface. For some pilots, victory in the sky would not protect them from suspicion on the ground. Ethnic identity, political paranoia, and wartime hysteria would shadow even decorated aces. The same state that celebrated heroism could also question loyalty. And in that contradiction, between triumph and mistrust, another story was unfolding, one that would expose the uneasy reality behind Soviet victory. If you value stories that reveal not just who won, but how individuals carried history on their shoulders, consider subscribing and liking the video. It helps more viewers discover these layered, human chapters of the Second World War, where courage and complexity coexist in equal measure. Because as the Red Air Force matured into a formidable weapon, the war was entering its final, decisive phase, and the skies of Eastern Europe were about to witness their most dramatic transformation yet. By 1944, the sound of the war in the East had changed. The desperate scrambling of 1941 was gone. In its place rose disciplined formations, confident radio chatter, and fighters climbing not in panic, but in control. Soviet industry had surged beyond the Urals, delivering improved aircraft in staggering numbers. Training had matured, survivors of catastrophe had become instructors. The Red Air Force was no longer fighting merely to endure, it was shaping the battlefield. And yet, even as it approached supremacy in the skies, the contradictions of the Soviet state were tightening their grip on the men who had helped secure it. Among them was Amet-khan Sultan. A Crimean Tatar by heritage, Sultan entered the war flying British-supplied Hurricanes before transitioning to Yak-1 South, American P-39 Airacobras, and eventually the La-7. His combat career stretched across the Caucasus, Ukraine, and Eastern Europe. Like Kovzan before him, his first victory reportedly came through ramming, not by doctrine, but necessity, when his guns failed mid-engagement. But Sultan was more than a survivor. He was methodical, sharp-eyed, relentless in pursuit. Over the course of the war, he would be credited with 30 individual and 19 shared victories. Twice he was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. In the air, his loyalty was unquestioned. His record was written in gun camera film and enemy wreckage. On the ground, however, identity became a liability. In 1944, as Soviet forces pushed westward, the NKVD began mass deportations of entire ethnic groups accused of collaboration. Among them were the Crimean Tatars. Families were rounded up, transported east under brutal conditions. Sultan, a decorated ace, watched as suspicion swept across his community. His own brother was arrested for alleged collaboration and never returned. He continued flying. That is the contradiction of Soviet victory, a system capable of producing extraordinary military adaptation while simultaneously distrusting its own citizens. Sultan survived the war and later became a celebrated test pilot, helping to shape post-war aviation. But his story reminds us that triumph in combat did not guarantee security in peace. At the same time, another transformation was unfolding, one not of ethnicity, but of doctrine. Alexander Pokryshkin had lived through the disasters of 1941. He had seen rigid formations shattered and pilots lost because they were forbidden to deviate from orders. Where others complied, he questioned. Where doctrine demanded tight, vulnerable groupings, he advocated flexibility. He valued altitude advantage, surprise, coordinated aggression. His approach was controversial at first. Initiative could be mistaken for insubordination. But results speak loudly in wartime. Pokryshkin's unit began scoring heavily. He emphasized mutual support, fluid maneuvering, and tactical independence within coordinated frameworks. His ideas spread. Gradually, Soviet fighter tactics evolved from reactive defense to proactive dominance. By 1945, the transformation was undeniable. In February of that year, Ivan Kozhedub, the once instructor who had survived 6 attackers in 1943, encountered one of the most advanced aircraft of the war, the German Me-260 jet. Faster than any piston-engine fighter, it represented Germany's last technological gamble. Yet even jets were vulnerable in the right circumstances. Kozhedub engaged and shot it down. The symbolism was profound. In 1941, the Red Air Force had been overwhelmed by conventional fighters. In 1945, it was destroying jets. Kozhedub would finish the war with 62 individual victories, the highest tally of any Allied pilot. But numbers alone do not explain the transformation. The arc from catastrophe to competence to dominance was not automatic. It was forged through individuals, disciplined masters, desperate survivors, pioneers who broke barriers, patriots under suspicion, reformers who challenged doctrine. From Kozhedub's precision to Kovzan's collisions, to Litvyak's defiant grace, to Sultan's loyalty under doubt, to Pokryshkin's tactical revolution, through cockpit glass, we witness the evolution of a military institution under unimaginable pressure. In 1941, the Soviet Air Force was rigid, battered, bleeding. By 1945, it was adaptable, experienced, lethal. The skies of the Eastern Front were vast and merciless. They did not reward ideology, they rewarded adaptation. And in those skies, adaptation meant survival, and survival eventually meant supremacy.